This is Court Watch with Alex Swoyer, and I'm excited to bring you the latest episode of my podcast, where I am joined in studio with Tennessee's Attorney General Jonathan Skrmetti. His state had a major Supreme Court argument this week over Tennessee's ban on medical procedures and treatments, like puberty blockers and hormone therapy for minors looking to transition to the opposite sex. The state's law, known as SB 1, was passed in 2023, but was challenged by the Biden administration and the American Civil Liberties Union, which argue it discriminates on the basis of sex. They say the Supreme Court should reverse the Sixth Circuit's move and force the lower courts to reevaluate the case on a higher level of scrutiny. The Sixth Circuit had sided with Tennessee and allowed the law to take effect. Thank you so much, Attorney General Skrmetti, for sitting down and joining us in studio. I really appreciate it. I was in the courtroom yesterday, and I noticed you were sworn into the Supreme Court bar right ahead of oral arguments for really what, for our audience, has been following this case. But basically, I just want to underscore how important it is. It's the first time, really, the justices took up, I guess you could call it a trans rights case that considers constitutionality in question, the Equal Protection Clause. And so the justices had 1 hour of oral arguments. It went, almost 3 hours? I don't know if you were like me. I was like, where is the restroom? I had to dart out of the courtroom as soon as it was over. But what did you make of what you heard? What was that experience like?
So the biggest takeaway was the length of the arguments. This is a case that potentially has significant precedential value. The justices know that, and they asked a lot of questions because they want to make sure they get it right. So I was heartened by the fact that they're taking it so seriously. I would expect them to, but there were probing questions from all around. And, there could always be a narrow opinion. There could always be something that moves in an unexpected direction. Mm-hmm. But this is the first constitutional case addressing gender identity issues. And so the lower courts, even if it's written narrowly, the lower courts are going to be getting what guidance they can from it because they haven't had any guidance.
Right. Bostock,
very textual statutory case that I don't think really applies in this context. The Biden administration has tried to read Bostock very broadly, but if you actually read the opinion and look at Justice Gorsuch's approach, it is written about specific language in Title VII, and I don't think you can import it here. So there's really not a lot of constitutional guidance at all.
Right.
For the lower courts.
And I know the administration has been using Bostock, and just to remind our listeners, Bostock was about the Civil Rights Act. It had to do with LGBTQ workplace issues. I think there was one gay man, one transgender employee, and it's basically unrelated to the equal protection question that comes before the court with your case. But I know the Biden administration has tried to use that when it comes to school locker rooms, school bathrooms, and so they even brought it up during oral arguments yesterday. And so I was going to ask you about that specifically. Why do you think that they've gone to Bostock? Is it because it's really the only precedent there is?
Yes. I mean, Bostock is the only guidepost the Supreme Court has given for how to look at these issues. And so people are latching onto it because there's no alternative. Mm-hmm. The lower courts are seeing a significant volume of litigation involving these issues. Things have changed so much in the last few years. And we've seen a very aggressive use of our civil rights laws on sex discrimination to try to force some pretty fundamental changes involving gender identity. So locker rooms, sports teams,
absolutely,
pronoun use, some pretty basic parts of day-to-day life. And Bostock is the only guidance the Supreme Court's given. So the lower courts are seeing a lot of cases and trying to figure out what the law is. It's really important that the Supreme Court gives them clarity, which I think is why they granted cert in this case.
Right, and I guess especially because it went for, the Biden administration, it's one they're using every chance that they can, whether it's sports issues, school bathrooms, or in this case. One of the aspects of yesterday that everyone in the press section was paying attention to Justice Gorsuch, which I'm sure he's the one who authored Bostock. So the fact that he didn't ask any questions, I know I'm asking you to be a mind reader, but what do we make of that?
I hesitate to speculate, but I think all of the justices were paying close attention and thinking hard about some pretty complicated legal arguments. That gender identity doesn't map well onto the existing sort of civil rights architecture because you have sort of two layers. You're not just looking at sex discrimination because there's this other identity layer on top of it. So it's a little bit hard to conceptualize. And I think even the vocabulary used is difficult. So I wouldn't read too much into questions being asked. I mean, the justices will have months to deliberate. And even if, a lot of people think they know how the case is going to turn out. But even if the justices show their hand and are pretty transparent, and I don't know that they are during argument, they have months to think it over, months to debate with each other.
Try to encourage each other to take their side.
Yeah, so you can't read too much into the argument other than that they're thinking hard about these issues.
So when I cover cases, I sit there and I like to keep kind of a little tally for myself from questions, okay? Like, who do I think is on the same page? And so I thought the questions that Justice Barrett asked, the Chief Justice, they seemed to be a little bit more difficult for the other side. So I thought that would bode well for Tennessee. Of course, Gorsuch was quiet. Kavanaugh kind of showed his hand a bit, I thought, where he was going. With all that said, I thought your side had more. I had more little names next to Tennessee, okay, when I left the courtroom. So if the justices were to side with you, could hypothetically, with a Republican Congress coming in, could they look to Tennessee's law and implement something like that on a federal level?
So it's possible they would try to, but there's a whole other set of constitutional issues there involving limits on the scope of federal authority that are just totally unrelated to this case. So even if there's not an equal protection clause deterrent to states adopting these laws, we have sued the Biden administration a lot.
I was going to ask you about that too.
Over their laws along these lines. And one of the arguments that we frequently make is this is outside the scope of federal authority. And it would not surprise me to see the Californias and New Yorks of the world bring a similar lawsuit if the Trump administration did that. Now, I don't know how it will turn out, but I think there's a whole other dimension to this that makes it difficult to say a green light for Tennessee means a green light for a Republican Congress.
Right. And so with Tennessee's law banning transgender youth from having medical treatment related to puberty blockers, hormone therapy, surgeries, the question, or what the Biden administration and ACLU really were pushing, was under the equal protection, that it's treating boys and girls differently because one could access puberty blockers when another one couldn't. But one of the things that I thought was that Justice Thomas hit on, that's like the overarching issue with the law, is age. It's a restriction for minors. And so can you kind of expand a little bit on that aspect? And also then when we saw some of the justices on the liberal wing of the court bringing up issues like trying to equate it to interracial marriage laws that have been struck down, like barring, I think it was Loving v. Virginia, with a white man wasn't lawfully allowed to marry a black woman. Where was there any connection there? Is there not?
So, there's been a lot of commentary about that line of questioning. And I think some of it is a little unfair. I think the point that Justice Jackson was trying to get at was, we have this case where you have two people from different races, and the law said that they couldn't marry someone from another race. And she's equating that to saying if you have two people of different sexes and they can't take the same hormone treatment, then that's facially sex discrimination. I think the problem there, and the point that my exceptional Solicitor General Matt Rice was trying to make, is when you take a medical treatment, you don't just take drugs. Nobody just hands you drugs and says, take these. There's always a condition underlying it. And to evaluate the use of medicine, you have to look at the condition being treated. If someone has gangrene, cutting off their leg makes a lot of sense. If someone has a stubbed toe, it would be insane to cut their leg off. Yeah. So, and Matt's example was, you can take morphine for serious pain relief. That's different than giving someone morphine to kill them in a physician-assisted suicide. And with the hormone treatments, boys' and girls' bodies are different. They are fundamentally different. They're affected differently by hormones. And that's where the confusion in this comes in. That's why there's this sex discrimination argument from the other side. But it's not some arbitrary fact. It's just fundamental. Every human being is male or female, and males and females have different interactions with drugs sometimes. And
one of the things that I don't know if you saw, but now that everything's live streamed, you think, oh, people probably listen to oral arguments via audio when they're happening rather than in the courtroom, right? Because we don't have video in there. But Justice Kavanaugh's face, it was interesting to me because the Biden administration Solicitor General, she actually acknowledged what you just said, that fundamentally there is a biological difference between male and female. And I remember I was looking at Justice Kavanaugh at the time, and his eyebrows went up. And then he followed up with questions about, you mentioned previously, like how that then applies to how they could rule in this case. How would that impact issues like women's sports with transgender athletes trying to compete with women's sports? What was your take on how that was posed?
You mean the women's
sports issue? Like, for example, if they were to rule against Tennessee, what would that mean for women's sports?
Well, if they rule against Tennessee and find some sort of heightened constitutional standard, it means the states will have an uphill battle
in lower courts.
In lower courts, keeping biological boys out of girls' sports. And Justice Kavanaugh was a basketball coach. This is something that matters a lot to him and that he's very familiar with. So I can see why that would be.
And coaches his daughters, I think it was, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So it makes sense to me that that's the context he's concerned with. But if they say that there's a heightened level of scrutiny here, or if they identify transgender status as a protected class, it's going to insert the courts a lot more into these other policy decisions. Whereas if they say rational basis applies, there's no constitutional violation here, it doesn't guarantee an outcome. It means democracy makes the decision. The people elect their representatives and they decide.
And that was something I think the Chief Justice hit on about democracy. Also, Justice Kavanaugh, I think he said something like, doesn't that sound like let democracy address this, especially when we're talking about moving science? And that was my next question was, I've covered the court since 2017, and very, very rarely do the justices talk about what other countries are doing or laws in other countries. So I found that extremely interesting. I think it was Justice Alito, Justice Kavanaugh, maybe it was the Chief Justice. Several times questions came up about Sweden and the UK, that they have actually pulled back on medical treatment for transgender youth. And they've cited various reports and studies about the risks, the damage done. Can you, how significant is that? And also there was talk a lot about the harms that from some of these young people who are taking these drugs, what this means for them, like infertility. Can you expand on that too?
Yeah, starting with Europe, I think the European example is hugely important because it makes clear that this is not an American culture war issue. The UK and Sweden are not red states. They do not have the values that Tennessee has. They don't have the other policies we have. They don't have the electorate we have. But they looked at the evidence. And even though these were countries that had enthusiastically adopted these treatments for kids, when they went back and they looked at the evidence, they realized that the risks dramatically outweighed the benefits, and they severely restricted access. There's still access in certain very limited contexts, or there are age limits that differ a little bit from ours, but they've gone from being very open to this treatment to much, much, much more cautious about it. And that's an indicator for everybody looking at this objectively that it's not just a red-blue culture war battle.
What are some of the issues? I know on the other side, they talk about without these drugs, there's increased suicide for trans youth. I don't know if that's disputed with other reports or if, we talked about infertility. What are some other, I think I've heard, what are some other medical conditions that children could have if they take these, like hormone therapies?
So it's got a very, very significant impact on kids. Now, the suicide issue, I want to address that first because it's really important. We don't want kids to kill themselves. I mean, gender dysphoria is hard. Regardless of what we do in terms of treatment, it is a hard thing for a kid to deal with. Most kids will outgrow it, but while they have it, that's cold comfort. It is a difficult life to live. And for a long time, the narrative was you have to let your kids transition. You need to get them on these drugs. You need to get them on the road to permanent transition because otherwise they'll kill themselves. And the line was, you can have a live son or a dead daughter. And it was a horrific way to address parents. It put them under such pressure. The most important thing that happened in oral argument from my perspective was a colloquy between Justice Alito and Chase Strangio in which Strangio acknowledged Justice Alito's point that these treatments do not reduce suicide for kids.
Which he was the lawyer representing the ACLU, which has plaintiffs that are transgender youth for our audience that are following this. So that was interesting that he acknowledged that.
And because suicide is in part driven by these social contagion factors, the narrative matters. And it's important that we get out there that it is not an inevitable path to suicide if we block kids from getting these treatments. But in terms of the biological impact, if you give a boy with a testosterone deficiency testosterone, it ensures that he's going to grow up with functional fertility and avoid health problems. But if you give a girl testosterone, then there's the potential there for lifelong loss of fertility, for lifelong loss of sexual function, and the conditions vary somewhat if it's a boy or a girl receiving the cross-sex hormone, but blood clots, tumors, puberty blockers can cause fertility problems and serious bone density deficiencies, and all of them can cause cognitive development impairments. So you're talking about really serious lifelong consequences for kids who are put on these drugs.
I have talked to my readers about this really being the blockbuster case of the term. Any guess, June, is this one of the ones that they hold on to until the very end before recess?
I would be shocked if we got this early. I would not be surprised if it came very late, but the court's going to do what the court is going to do.
Right.
I hesitate to guess too aggressively about it. But given the significance potentially of the precedent, and even if the court tries to limit it, at least until they have another case, the lower courts are going to devour whatever they say. So I think they'll take a long time to make sure they get it right.
Just off the top of my head, you mentioned the potential if the court were to create some sort of class for transgender individuals protection. That I think it was Justice Kagan who brought that up potentially. Do you think there's an appetite there to do that with this, or would I guess since this is their first really transgender rights constitutional case they're taking up, do you think they'll go that far at this point?
The court hasn't identified a new protected class in something like 60 or 70 years. I think they're extremely reluctant generally to do that. I hesitate to predict too much, but that seems like a pretty unlikely scenario.
Yeah, and I also recall, I think it was Justice Barrett who brought up, well, usually with that type of situation, there's a long case line or evidence of discrimination, and you don't really have as much with this respect that you do, for example, with race she was talking about. You said, we don't really know what they're going to do with this case. So there's a change of administration. This case is U.S. v. Skrmetti, right? So with Trump coming in, the Trump DOJ presumably will take a different stance than the Biden DOJ in this. How does that impact where this case could go? Could the justices dismiss it as, basically granted too early? What do you think?
So the justices have a lot of discretion. They could do any of a number of things. But there's case law out there from the Supreme Court that as long as a party has litigated it, even if they're not the petitioning party, the case can continue. Here, the ACLU fully briefed the case. The ACLU argued the case on behalf of the private plaintiffs. And so even if the U.S. switches positions, that doesn't necessarily mean the case stops.
Mm-hmm. And you would like to see, or I'm guessing you would like to see a ruling.
I mean, we won below.
Yeah.
So, but this is an area where there's just such a pointed lack of clarity. And we have a lot of cases involving gender identity issues in Tennessee. We have a legislature that's very concerned about those issues.
Well, I think also we mentioned this women's sports. I think there's cert petitions from West Virginia and Idaho still pending on this issue. So I was also thinking maybe they're waiting to see how the court goes here in determining if they have to take up another one.
And that could be, the justices have many options in front of them, and they get to make that decision. That's their role. But I think sometime soon, if it's this case or another case, it would be very, very helpful for a lot of people litigating these cases. I mean, just in terms of the amount of money that's being spent, because there's not a clear answer out there about some pretty fundamental constitutional questions, it would be great to get clarity. I mean, we're kind of in...
And it would guide lower court judges as well. Like you mentioned,
Exactly.
Bostock is really all they've had to go off of. I guess my last question I'll throw at you is, I know Tennessee has been active with challenging the Biden administration in a number of areas. One I have covered was the student loan issue, the student loan forgiveness from the Biden administration, which has taken different forms. Most recently, I think there was a recent announcement right before the election. How do you expect something like that to change with the changing administration? I know red state AGs have been very active with going after and challenging overreach from the Biden administration. How do you expect that to change in the coming years?
Well, one of the reasons we've been so active is because what the Biden administration has tried to illegally do through regulation conflicts with our state policies and our state laws. If there's no conflict, we don't have standing to sue the federal government. What you might see, and of course, politically, I think it's really hard for a lot of people to push back against the federal government when it's doing what their side wants it to do.
Mm-hmm.
But you might see some amicus briefs from the states who, even if we agree with the policies that the federal government's pursuing, may want to note the limits on federal power because at some point the White House will change hands again.
Exactly, yeah.
Limiting federal overreach is not sort of a short-term thing to stop one administration. It's a long-term project to ensure that the Constitution continues to be our system of government. And the Constitution provides an important but a limited role to the federal government, and it reserves the general police powers to the states. So we'll see how much stomach the Republican AGs have to do this, but it's a possibility, and it's something I've thought about. Because I think when you have the Californias and New Yorks pushing for limits on the federal government, that's a great opportunity to secure some long-term wins structurally. But at the same time, a lot of these are policies that are really important to us and to the people of our states. So that's something.
The line will be protecting state rights and from federal overreach. My last question to you is, I know you've done a media tour talking about US v. Skrmetti like for the past, 48 hours. What's one question that you don't think is asked or you think there's a misconception out there that you want to address? Not to put you on the spot, but I always like to ask, what did I miss here?
So there have been a lot of concerns raised on the other side about limiting this to children, and there's a lot of fear that there will be a universal ban going after adults. And I haven't received a lot of questions about that, but it's clearly something that's important to a lot of folks. And I think if you look at the record in Tennessee's legislature, the focus was on kids, that they can't meaningfully consent to these life-altering procedures, that the risks are severely understudied at best. There's no evidence of benefits to kids. The number of kids on these treatments has exploded, massive increase.
And I think also cognitive development was something that was mentioned.
Correct. With adults, none of those factors apply. And so even if legally the standard is such that that's a possibility, I don't think, based on my observation of what legislatures are doing, I don't know that people need to be as worried about that as some of the rhetoric I've seen. Now, obviously, people are entitled to their opinions. This is America. But this really, from our perspective, is a kid-focused case. The line here that we're defending is an age line, and kids are different than adults. There's a huge difference there. There's a huge difference in the state's role. Adults are much freer, and they're allowed to make choices that we disagree with that could have really bad consequences because they're in a position to make their own determination. We've recognized forever that kids can't make the same decisions. We don't let them get tattoos. We don't let them drink alcohol, consume tobacco. Yeah, there are contract limitations because we don't want to bind them in the future to decisions that they're not capable of making to the same extent that adults can. So this is a kid-focused case, and I think a lot of the fear about potential implications will possibly legally accurate depending on how the opinion's worded. I don't know that there's a lot of appetite to do that.
Okay. Well, great. Thank you so much for coming here and answering our questions about this case. I'd love to have you back. Maybe we can talk in July after we have an idea of where the court goes. We're all speculating about, this justice made this face and asked this question, but I guess we'll have to see what we get.
We'll all see how wrong we were.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to the latest episode of Court Watch. If you have not subscribed yet to this podcast, please do so, and also feel free to email me interesting questions or topics you want explored about the legal reporting world. I'll do my best to answer them during each episode. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to hearing from you all soon. Listen to my podcast, Court Watch, at WashingtonTimes.com or wherever you get your favorite podcasts.